There's a couple of suites and conference rooms up there, and guards.
So how are we gonna get up there?
Round the back, through the laundry room.
Why, you wanna wash your shorts before we do this?
Wise ass.
There's nothing like a badass sidekick, someone who's loyal, helpful, and when push comes to shove is more than willing to get their hands dirty. I think we get the perfect quote-unquote sidekick in John Donovan. I previously covered the invaluable amounts of help he was in Lincoln Clay's war in New Bordeaux. Of course, that's just scratching the surface on the relationship and friendship between the pair, so if you want to check that video or Lincoln Clay's dedicated video, I encourage you to do so. However, today, we're discussing a side character that's often referred to as the main character of Mafia 2, the larger-than-life personality that is Joe Barbaro. Joe is loyal, cares deeply for those closest to him. Possibly most importantly is he's ambitious. Frankly, if it wasn't for him, many of the opportunities Vito Scaletta found himself having would not have been available, or would have taken him much longer to see. Joe is the one who introduced Vito to the earliest taste of the criminal underworld, beginning with working with the Clemente crime family once he returned home from serving in the US military, to then opening the door with working with the Falcone crime family as soon as Vito returned home from prison. Any opportunity that came knocking on Joe's door, he made sure to look out for Vito. And as he was rising up the ranks with the Falcone, he began to look out for Marty Santorelli, his younger childhood neighbor that always looked up to him. Joe made sure the kid was paid, well taken care of, and despite introducing him into dangerous situations, he still wanted the kid to be outside of the dangerous mob life. Well-meaning, as much as he may have always been, Joe's aspirations didn't always pay off with the most positive outcomes. This resulted in Vito's mom in particular viewing Joe as a bad influence and the reason behind all of, if not most, of Vito's trouble, attributing Vito's sentence to the military largely due to Joe's bad influence on his lifelong friend. Today we're going to be diving into the rich and complex character of Joe Barbaro, from his early days first meeting a young Vito Scaletta to how he managed to establish the many contacts that later helped to get Vito out of the rest of his military service and working to pay off the crippling debt his father left their family in. From Vito's own account at the beginning of Mafia 2, he met Joe at a very young age. Both boys were immigrants living in the same impoverished neighborhood of Empire Bay that frankly most Italians coming from Italy found themselves settling in. Vito was forced to learn English, and because of that was sent to school where he first ran into Joe, who at the time was described as the neighborhood bully, running his own miniature gang of thieves and hoodlums. Instead of backing down in front of Joe, who was a much larger kid that would later keep his frame as he got older, Vito offered to fight Joe in exchange for a place within his gang. From the start, Joe was impressed by Vito's heart, and from that moment forward, the foundation of their friendship was set. Joe's charisma and devil-may-care attitude contrasted with Vito's cautious and serious demeanor. The two balanced each other out quite perfectly. Over time, they became inseparable, bonding over shared experiences of hardship and their mutual ambition to rise above their circumstances. As teenagers, their friendship deepened when they started engaging in petty crimes together. Joe would introduce Vito to the world of hustling, small-time theft, and mischief, which would help Vito support his struggling family while helping Joe's own aspirations of having something much larger and powerful for himself. Joe's knack for getting into trouble was matched by Vito's loyalty. Well, vice versa. That again made them quite a formidable duo. They looked out for each other, developed a brotherly bond that would endure into adulthood and set the stage for their later involvement in the criminal underworld. In the year of 1943 sounds like the first time they would have a quote-unquote hiccup. While breaking into a jewelry store, Vito and Joe were caught and chased down by a police officer. Joe would manage to escape, while Vito unfortunately would be arrested and offered the deal of either being sent to prison or joining the United States Army that was actively recruiting for individuals that could speak fluent Italian in preparation for the invasion of Italy. It was the first time Vito had ever gotten into any serious trouble, so he opted to join the military, where he would serve for the next 2 years. Joe, on the other hand, managed to get away with the merchandise they lifted from the jewelry store. Now, it's not exactly a big detail, but it is worth bringing up that before Vito got shipped off to take part in the war effort, him and Joe did see each other when they got the chance to. The last time of which being at the funeral of Vito's father, where the pair shared a drink and wished a safe journey ahead for the both of them. Vito, who was going to see active combat in Sicily, and Joe, who was, well, getting ready to sink his teeth into the bigger crime families of Empire Bay. As Vito navigated the dangerous battlefields in a foreign land, back home Joe would navigate serious dangers of his own, albeit of an entirely different nature, establishing a name for himself as someone who was effective, resourceful, and a bit of a character. Joe would establish the early connections that'll later be quite useful for Vito when he did return home from the military. Names such as Giuseppe Palmenteri, Mike Bruschi, Derek Papalardo, and eventually Henry Tomasino would all come to be familiar with the boisterous young man, with all of them coming to respect Joe. By the time Vito was back in Empire Bay on a momentary leave due to being shot in 1945, Joe leveraged each one of these contacts in order to properly take care of his best friend. Through Giuseppe, he was able to forge official legal documents claiming Vito was unfit to return to military service. Giuseppe would also help with teaching Vito how to break a lock. Mike Bruschi, on account of Joe vouching for Vito, would agree to work with him, provide him as much work as he was willing to take on for spare vehicles. And Derek Papalardo, a man that initially offered Vito a backhanded $10 for backbreaking work, would turn around and be much more generous, saying nobody that works for Joe should be carrying crates for $10. He instantly got bumped up in the hierarchy, after being vetted out by Derek, of course. But he'd receive higher pay for less backbreaking work. Even though it wasn't any more glamorous working as a muscle to keep Derek's workers in line, it was still much better than what Vito described as slave labor, and at the end of the day, he was easily getting paid 5 times more the amount. While Joe sent that groundwork, it certainly took him time to reach the big money. Yes, he had his own furnished apartment, nice coats, and a brand new car from what Vito saw. And that was a far cry from Vito's own position, having a mere $20 from his name given to him by the military and having no place to stay, crashing on Joe's couch. But most of Joe's nice stuff was all earned in the last 3 months, with more barriers for him to break down, starting with aligning himself with the Clemente crime family. In February of 1945, Vito and Joe were introduced to Henry Tomasino, a made man in the Clemente crime family, and the chance for them to start making serious money. Henry offered the pair work, starting with Vito sent to steal some gas stamps from the Office of Price Administration. Vito would do so successfully, with the problem of discovering that they would expire the next day, forcing Vito to sell the stamps to local gas stations in the area before midnight. It was a small hiccup, but all things considered, it was still quite a success. With that success, they'd open the door of the next job, robbing a jewelry store. The owner was late on paying back money owed to the Clemente crime family. So in order to get all of that money in jewels, Luca Guarino, capo of the Clemente family, greenlit Joe and Vito to rob the store. How was completely left up to them, with Joe doing most of, if not all of the planning. He procured phone company uniforms so they could pretend to fix something in the event anyone noticed them, and there was no security for the jewel store late at night, so it should have all been a cakewalk. The only reason it wasn't was due to Brian O'Neill, head of the O'Neill gang, having the bright idea of robbing the jewelry store as well. A standoff between the gang and the pair only broke off thanks to police intervention. In the end, O'Neill and his associates would be arrested, with Joe and Vito making off with the jewels. Fresh off the success of a jewelry heist, the Clemente family upped the stakes, offering Vito and Joe a chance at becoming made men, as long as they successfully pull off a hit and put up the fee of $5,000 each for their initiation. Considering Joe never objected or said anything apart from that being a fortune, it's clear he still had quite a lot to learn on how the life he was trying to enter worked. The hit was Henry's job, so it was more so Joe and Vito helping him rather than the other way around. Despite Henry preparing as much as he could, renting out an apartment to catch his target off guard, and buying an MG-42 to gun down everyone in the street, his hit would manage to escape inside a nearby building, resulting in more bullets being spent and more blood being spilled in an effort to catch this man. They would eventually managed to corner him, but instead of it being quick and clean, the cornered man would end up shooting Henry in the leg, resulting in Joe and Vito angrily lighting him up. Despite Henry being a casualty, the hit was a success in more ways than one. Joe, Vito, and Henry established a better understanding of each other before the shooting ever started, creating not just a level of mutual respect all around, but the groundwork of some kind of friendship between the trio. Henry would also never forget what Vito and Joe did for him here, not only helping with the hit, but chauffeuring him directly to be patched up by Greco the painter.
Get me to El Greco.
The fucking painter?
No, the fucking doctor, you
Take
idiot.
it easy.
It's a favor that would later come into play when Henry directly saves Joe's life. 6 days after the hit, and getting Henry to Greco the doctor, Vito is arrested outside Joe's apartment. In the event Joe witnesses from his apartment window, he'd immediately call Freddy's Bar, a popular spot owned by the Clemente crime family that serves as a front for their criminal activities, and while he was initially looking for Henry, he wasn't present, but Luca Guarino was. and he would share with Joe that Vito was busted for the gasoline stamps Henry had him steal a week earlier. A gas station attendant decided to rat him out, and since the man was in Joe's neighborhood and he felt so passionately about his friend being busted, it was up to Joe to send him a message. However, he is not allowed to kill the man. He can break his legs, he can break his arms, he can end up in a wheelchair, do whatever it takes, but he cannot die, and there must not be enough heat drawn to anybody for whatever Joe does. So kicks off the DLC of Joe's adventures. It began as a form of vengeance, but much of the DLC highlights Joe's loyalty and level of caring for Vito. To be fair, kind of not just for Vito. I'd say Joe easily blows his top whenever anyone he cares for gets hurt or screwed over. We see it here with Vito being busted, as well as Henry and Marty's death in the main game. He does have a very strong capacity for caring for those closest to him, which is so intense it causes more trouble for him. Trouble aside, he can also be terrifyingly cold-blooded. Two prime examples being him loading an entire magazine of bullets into Alberto Clemente's driver and Alberto Clemente's body himself in the wake of Marty's death, smacking, threatening, and ultimately killing Mr. Wong after witnessing the brutal killing of Henry in a public park, no less. Those are deaths in contrast to Vito just being arrested, but it still highlights the passion and care for Joe. But focusing back on Luca Guarino and Vito being arrested, Guarino points Joe in the direction of the gas attendant that snitched, and then goes to send Joe to deal with a man by the name of Richie Mazzio, a former soldado within the Clemente crime family that has decided to flip on the organization, and he began working with the authorities. It's because of him that the rest of the Clemente crime family organization and overall operation could be threatened. The man is currently within Empire Bay's protective custody, but it's up to Joe to make sure he doesn't reach the stand. While Guarino's priorities is clearly focused on the overall organization and operations, which is a fair concern, all things considered, Joe meanwhile continues to ask about Vito. Has anyone heard from Vito? What's going on with him? Knowing if his best friend is okay is his first priority. Never mind if the whole Clemente family is busted. That is a secondary objective. If it wasn't for the calmness in his voice whenever asking, you could say his concern was borderline panicking. After killing Richie Mazzio and making sure the gas attendant never returns to Empire Bay, Joe immediately heads to Freddy's bar, where he continues to ask Luca about Vito. It's not until Luca comforts him by saying he's getting Vito the best lawyer in town, and should be out in no time, that is Joe finally calmed down. It was only for a brief moment though. Joe personally attended Vito's trial, and would angrily walk out of the courtroom as soon as he heard the verdict. Vito was being sentenced 10 years in a federal penitentiary. From the courtroom, Joe would immediately head to Freddy's bar and instantly confront Luca Guarino on the bold-faced lie of making sure Vito would be out in no time. The two would get into a public argument here in Freddy's bar that ultimately pissed off Luca, who took offense from a no-name man like Joe to openly confront him like that. As a result, Luca would add Joe's name to a hit list. In less than 24 hours, Joe Barbaro would be dead, and it would have been so if it wasn't for the intervention of Henry Tomasino. Catching wind that Luca added Joe's name to a hit list, and remembering that Joe not only saved his life back at the distillery when he was shot, but he also stood with him overnight at El Greco's house. So to repay the favor, Henry would call Joe and inform him that in less than 5 minutes, Luca's hitmen would be entering Joe's building. Now initially, Joe couldn't care less. He told him, let them come. But Henry reminded him, Joe has no protection. He might be able to deal with this hit squad, but then they'll just come tomorrow, and then the next day, with more men and more firepower increasing with each visit. Eventually, Joe will cave under that weight. Facing no other options, Joe would see the logic here and heed Henry's warning, deciding it was the wise choice to skip town. In his absence, he organized a friend to look out for his place, a man by the name of Antonio Balsamo, otherwise known as Tony Balls. Vito would later recall after 3 days in prison, he got word from Joe to look for Leo Galante to help him improve his stay in Hartman Penitentiary. Vito would learn from Leo directly that Leo had no love or connections with the Clemente family, and as it turns out, by that time, Joe did neither. But Vito had no idea of that. As a footnote, pointing Vito to Leo Galante may have been an idea brought up by Tony Balls, considering Joe's own lack of knowledge on how the families worked, again citing the lack of objecting to Luca mentioning a quote-unquote initiation fee. Tony, on the other hand, has been around for some time. He originally worked for Tommaso Moretti, Don of the Moretti crime family, and during those years he was Moretti's personal driver. The Moretti crime family went to war against the Vinci crime family, and it wasn't until 1933 when that war was brought to a swift end, when Carlo Falcone, another capo inside the Moretti crime family, with the help of Leo Galante, planted a bomb underneath Tommaso Moretti's vehicle. Tommaso was instantly killed, and Tony Balls was seriously injured. And so it stands to reason that Tony Balls is well aware of the Vinci as well as the Clemente crime family, and now he's a part of the newly formed, well, relatively speaking, newly formed Falcone crime family. It's an interesting idea that Joe, while exiled, managed to get that message to Vito, still looking out for his best friend. Joe would be gone from Empire Bay for 5 years, returning to the city in 1950, roughly a year before Vito's sentence was cut short thanks to the help of Leo Galante. In that year, Joe did his best to quickly make up for lost time. He'd go on working for Giuseppe, Mike Bruschi, and Derek Papalardo yet again. He'd help Marty get out of trouble, and most importantly take jobs given by Tony Balls. Jobs that directly helped with the interests of the Falcone crime family. After successfully completing several jobs for Tony, Joe's defining moment arrived when the two orchestrated a daring heist, stealing military-grade equipment that was being smuggled through the docks without paying tribute to Derek, the man who controlled them. After eliminating the guards and making off with the valuable cargo, Tony and Joe celebrated their triumph at the Garden of Eden, a notorious cat house. It was there that Joe was first introduced to Eddie Scarpa, a respected capo in the Falcone crime family. Eddie, having heard nothing but praise about Joe, was impressed by his work on the shipment. He acknowledged Joe's potential, telling him that as long as he continued to deliver on his jobs and kept his nose clean, Eddie would consider pulling some strings to lift the hit Lucas still had on him, which was still active. After his meeting with Eddie Scarpa, Joe began taking on jobs directly for him, eliminating a district attorney who refused a bribe, roughing up a man who got too handsy with the girls at the Garden of Eden, and running guns for the family are just a few jobs he would take on to further cement his help to the Falcone crime family. But the job that truly cemented his standing, securing both Eddie's favor and the Falcone family's protection, was a high-stakes supermarket heist he and Tony pulled off. The job was more than just a payday. It was a trial by fire. As Joe and Tony battled through waves of heavily armed police officers, Joe proved he wasn't just another street thug. He could hold his own in a firefight, even under intense pressure. The score was quite lucrative, but more importantly, it earned Joe a formal introduction to Rocco, an underboss in the Falcone crime family. Unlike Eddie, Rocco had greater autonomy, running his own crew and overseeing various rackets, but beneath his power and influence lay a dangerous ambition. Like Eddie before him, Rocco began handing jobs out to Joe. But while Eddie focused on expanding the Falcone family's influence and revenue streams, Rocco's priorities lay elsewhere. His operations were turned inward, rooting out supposed traitors within the family. He ordered hits on men he claimed were skimming from Falcone. Others he accused of plotting against him. At first, Joe followed orders without question, but as the jobs piled up, he began to grow suspicious. The accusations seemed much too convenient and far too calculated. Sensing something was off, he confronted Rocco and Eddie at the Garden of Eden, demanding answers. And that's when Rocco's true intentions came to light. He wasn't protecting the family. He was positioning himself to overthrow Falcone, and his coup was set to begin right there, with the deaths of both Eddie and Joe. Blasting their way out of the cat house, Eddie and Joe fought their way through the chaos and pursued Rocco to the Minsheld construction site, where he regrouped with the last of his men. As they arrived, Eddie remained outside waiting in his car, while Joe ventured in alone, ready to finish off what Rocco had set in motion back at the cat house. The site instantly became a war zone. In a brutal, drawn-out firefight, Joe cut down Rocco's men one by one, tearing through the skeletal remains of the unfinished building. At last, he cornered Rocco on the rooftop. Desperate, Rocco tried to warn Joe about Falcone, but his words fell on deaf ears. Without hesitation, Joe hurled him from the rooftop, sending him plummeting to the street below, where his body crashed onto the hood of Eddie's car. Startled and still drunk, Eddie could only stare in shock as the bloody remnants of Rocco's failed coup lay before him. Rocco's death and Joe's role in solidifying Carlo Falcone's position as Don marked a turning point. Lucas' hit was officially wiped away. From that moment on, despite not yet being a made man, Joe was untouchable. Eddie personally negotiated the finer details with Alberto Clemente, while Falcone himself met with Luca to settle the matter directly. In the end, both families reached an understanding. Joe Barbaro was no longer a dead man walking. And if anybody in the Clemente crime family had eyes on him or aspirations to take him out, well, they had the bigger matter of the entire Falcone family to deal with. By 1951, Joe was in a much better position than he ever was, and that was thanks to his time and efforts with the Falcone crime family the year prior. Vito, on the other hand, was being released from prison, and both men had connections within the Falcone and Vinci crime families thanks to Vito's new friendship with Leo Galante, Frank Vinci's own consigliere. Now, even though Joe was not yet a made man, the work he put in for Tony Balls, Eddie Scarpa, and Carlo Falcone personally by taking care of Rocco put him in a very good position with them, while he and Vito already had their own bones to pick with Luca Guarino personally. Luca, in an odd twist, would actually be dealt with by Tony Balls. Tony and two other associates of Carlo Falcone were kidnapped by Luca in an attempt to torture information out of them, particularly Harvey Epstein, who was Falcone's personal accountant. The kidnapping and torture of Falcone's men meant war could be justified by the commission, which led directly to Joe and Vito being sent to the Royal Hotel to kill Alberto Clemente and his entire top brass of men with a bomb planted in a conference room. The hit would succeed in killing everyone but Clemente himself, resulting in Joe and Vito shooting their way back to the parking garage where Joe would discover the lifeless body of Marty. He was only meant to be a getaway driver. His involvement was completely Joe's fault, and it was even a point of contention between him and Vito at the start of the job. Vito was well aware of the dangers a job like this can be inviting, and he even questioned what Joe was even thinking by considering Marty's involvement. Again, Joe just wanted to look out for those underneath him. While he was well-meaning, it was ignorant of him to think this wasn't a possibility. Joe's distraught over Marty's death would begin with a quiet, angry outburst directed at Clemente. Then over the next few days, he would drink himself numb, masking the pain of costing the young boy his life, accidentally killing a bartender while being drunkenly depressed, and then disappearing altogether for a few days, not even picking up payment for killing Clemente. Despite all the killing that Joe has no problem with, the death of Marty made it evident that he's not entirely cold-blooded, he's not conscience-free. And there's very few characters that get hit by such a hard reality check as Joe did with Marty. From an early age, it was evident Joe was ambitious. He craved something greater for himself, but was never selfish about it. He looked out for Vito every step of the way. Whenever Vito reluctantly asked for help or looked to Joe for any type of help, Joe never hesitated. He always extended his hand and was there to bust his friend's balls whenever the chance arose. When Joe was winning, the people he cared for most were winning as well. And when those he loved so dearly lost, well, someone was paying the price. I've talked in detail in many videos before on Henry's death and the impact Joe's reaction had on the relations of the triads and the Italian families. I think particularly the killing of Mr. Wong was one of the more defining moments where Joe and Vito weren't exactly on the same page. Their contrasting personalities and mentalities really stood out there. Joe was a bit more brash in reacting and just killing Mr. Wong, whereas Vito was a little bit more level-headed, mentioning how they could have got more information out of him. Or even the initial decision to venture into the Chinese restaurant and figure out where their money went to begin with. The plan was to enter low-key, figure out where Mr. Wong went and where their money's at, but instead, as soon as they walked in, Joe shot the two men in front.
Sorry, gentlemen, this place for member only.
Here's your fucking membership.
God damn it, Joe. Can't you listen to me for once?
No, I can't. You seen what they done to Henry.
In the end, Vito was exiled to New Bordeaux, striking a deal with Leo Galante and the Commission, agreeing to kill Carlo Falcone in exchange for being spared a death penalty, for vouching for a rat, and initiating a war. Thanks to the events of Joe's Adventures DLC, it makes a bit more sense as to why Joe would even entertain a deal with Carlo Falcone to begin with, guaranteeing him as a capo with his own crew in exchange for Vito's life. I mean, thanks to that DLC, we see that Joe had a longer, more complicated history with Falcone. And while Vito and Joe worked together to kill him, Leo Galante's decision to separate the two was for the best. The pair were far too dangerous to be together. I think Leo's decision to make it seem to at least Vito that Joe was killed and he wasn't part of the deal they struck was a very intelligent move. Leo was extremely intelligent and cunning throughout his entire career. He could have easily seen both men's worth. And Joe was quite useful. If one or both believed the other was dead, it stopped the incentive of looking for the other, and eliminate the possibility of their attempt of finding the other violating any agreements or deals Leo had struck, which might have been fragile at best. If Joe wanted to be in this life and Vito wanted to just be alive, with the commission also not wanting Vito in Empire Bay, I mean, between him and Joe, they both did kill Vinci and Falcone men, but it was Vito that arguably issued a bigger blow by killing Derek Pappalardo, who was a powerful capo in the Vinci family. He ran the entire dockyard, overwatching everything that came into the city via imports or that vital smuggling route. In the wake of Mafia 2, the criminal underworld of Empire Bay was drastically different, with both men having a hand in the how and why behind it all. Maybe all it really took was the one who loved Leo so much to break the rules of what was acceptable and what was punishable to save someone he cared about to be exiled, while the other was just cold-blooded enough to understand, love someone or not, rules are rules. If they do it to themselves, you're not allowed to intervene. And that was the one that could comfortably work as the personal chauffeur of Leo Galante, who would not only thrive, but be kept under a very close eye of the powerful consigliere.